So now we're going to come in. We're using this old project to see how could we layer in another complementary color, because our other one is drying right now. So orange with blue together is going to create even more of a dark value than just pure blue. Okay? If I just have blue here, even if it's pretty solid blue, okay, and see what happens. Right now we have the sphere. You can kind of see the core shadow, but what I can do here is I'm going to emphasize it and make it really obvious for you guys. Okay. And then come in. So when you do complementary colors, like I said at the couple minutes ago, you're not doing like one object blue, one object orange. Okay, you're going to see how you can use the two of them together. So see how by using blue with the orange, I created a much darker value. Okay, we're layering this on over an old project from a couple years ago. It's layering on there over pretty good actually. Okay, could I do the same thing with the cast shadow? Absolutely. The cast shadow is a little bit thick, so there might be a little bit of paint that ends up kind of coming off. We'll see if this works. Okay, there's a little bit of paint. I can almost feel it kind of up on top. I can kind of show you the difference too. If I take this, and even though, like I said, this painting is, you know, a few years old, if you can kind of see that there's a lot of paint built up there, which is different from over here where you can still see the paper through it. Okay, so for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to put blue on top of the shadow to make the cast shadow darker, but it's going to interact a little bit different because of the buildup of paint. Okay, so you can see I have a much bigger range of values because that orange was as like dark as it could be before, for sure, because I showed you that was the max amount of orange that was on the paper. So now I went over it with blue, and the blue I'm going over with is just like this, right? You can see it kind of started mixing. It got a little bit of the orange in the brush, but that was not a huge amount of paint. The orange was already so solid, a little bit of blue mixing together, and all of a sudden I have a much more dramatic cast shadow. Okay, when you look at it from farther away, that 3D effect is a lot more obvious. So the other thing, like we said, now this is blue with orange, so we have the cool color effect, which is going to make it look a little bit farther behind. So right here, this object is kind of behind this one. You can tell because it's higher back, right? What happens if I put a little bit of blue over this orange right here? Sorry, kind of paused my video there for a second. So if I take a little bit of blue and I layer this over, so like we said, the idea of doing complementary colors is you are going to layer okay, so that shadow, that little bit of blue, definitely made it go backwards, and it got me a darker shadow. Okay, so just think, you know, I could still add blue in here. Can I add blue by itself? Yes, absolutely, because I have orange by itself in some places. So there might be some areas where you might want to just do a little bit of blue. Okay, most everything's already painted, but let's just, for the sake of demonstration here, let's say right here, I got this little bit right here, of a background. Let's say I wanted to put a little bit of a blue background. I'll switch to a bigger brush here a second. Okay. What happens if I put a little bit of blue back here? Okay. Is that a nice little accent on the side of the orange? For sure. So you can use blue by itself. You can use orange by itself. Okay. But the layering of it also has to happen. One thing too is now that I have the blue on the cast shadow right here, doesn't this look like it's missing something? Yeah. So when you overlap colors to make a new color, right, a new value, so this dark shadow right here. So now, because the cast shadow and the core shadow, remember when you did your formula, cast shadow and core shadows are generally the same value. Now I need to come in here, I'm trying to avoid my part that I just painted because it's going to be a little wet. Okay, going to kind of exaggerate it a little bit for you. But even just that little bit of blue. Okay, now I can keep the, I can keep the orange on for the reflected light. The orange by itself will be just fine, right? But just because I have this now, okay, this makes more sense with the cast shadow now, right? I can still feather this out because it's a rounding object. It's a kind of a, if I was tracing it, it'd go this way. I can pull it out a little bit this way, okay? But I'm just gonna let that settle. So that's just showing you how you can work them both together. This technically is not monochromatic. There's a little bit of yellow thrown in there too. So the oranges and the blues are interacting really well together though, right? So you kind of see, you got a much more 3D effect going on, much bigger range of values. All right. So we're back to our vase, and I did a little bit of work and layered a few things on, but you can kind of see where we're going with that first layer. So this is monochromatic to start with. I started with the reds, got some darker shadows in there. Okay, so we're gonna kind of show you next steps, how you could do a little bit more with the red still. Once it's dry, you can kind of make that decision and work it a little bit more, add another layer of red. And then how to kind of go next level with adding in your complement. In this instance, I'm going to add some green, okay? Before I start, I showed you this the other day on the live session, but I'm going to try and model it a little bit on camera this time because I apologize. I kind of just did it automatically with the taking the paint off of here and then actually taking the paint from the mix with a little bit of water here because we'll talk more about that. But I'm going to kind of change my setup so you can maybe see that a little bit more. Two things for you guys to think about. Your tub water, make sure you're changing that regularly because, it's something we don't really think about a whole lot. But if I am painting, grab a different brush. If I am using, a lot of, say, red, right, and then painting, and when I put it back in my tub, guess what? My water is actually becoming, more red. So if you're doing a painting for a while and you're rinsing out your brush in between like you should, your water is going to become colored. So you're not going to get just a pure water if you're trying to do wet on wet or anything like that, okay? Just remember that. Remember also to make sure you're cleaning your brushes. So it's easy with watercolor at the end to just kind of swirl it around and you're good. But it's a good idea to just take a little bit of mild, like just dish soap, dilute it a little bit, just kind of do this a little bit, work it through, okay? And then rinse it really good and then make sure you are reshaping your brushes while they dry. And while you're painting, now that we're getting into a little bit longer projects, don't leave your paintbrushes in water, brush side down, for very long, okay? What happens is while your brush is wet, like we said, that's why you want to kind of squeeze out the extra water. But if your brush is, kind of doing this and it's like bent, like, that, when it dries, it'll start losing its edge and your brush will start doing stuff like this, just as it dries. So you'll lose your edge and your point, especially these smaller ones. If these are point down in the water for a long time, you're going to lose that sharp precision point, okay? All right, so as I get going with this again, I'm going to show you a little bit about if I want to keep adding a little bit more red, okay? Let's say I wanted to work on this like a little sphere for a little bit, okay? So I already kind of had it going here. But remember, if you're doing this with your paint, and if the paint brush is kind of almost like sticking, you know, to it, you can't just take the paint straight off of this onto there without it being a little thick. So you can kind of see what I was doing the other day. Grab a little bit of water, okay? And then you're kind of diluting it here. If this isn't dark enough, like if I added too much water to it, then I just grab some more paint. But the trick is, if I do this and I grab some more paint, I'm just going to come over here kind of to the side, and then I'm going to just grab the teeniest amount of water and then dilute it there, okay? If I add it to all of the water, it's going to take a lot longer. But instead, if I just grab the teeniest corner of the water, then I'm going to get a darker value like right away, okay? So I'm kind of just doing that automatically as I paint, so I just wanted to kind of reinforce that. All right, so as we were working on this, once it's dry, you know, this is kind of like my first layer of red. I did go back here a little bit off camera and kind of added a little bit more here because this is where we're going to add the green, so I wanted that to be developed enough to show you. But right here, this sphere, I did this wet on wet technique. So can I come in and add a little bit of a darker value? Maybe I feel like this isn't dark enough compared to some of the others. Okay, I can add more red. Could I go over this with green instead of, you know, adding more red? Absolutely. Okay. Remember, if I do this, this is kind of a what not to do. You know, yeah, I want my cast shadow. But then remember, if I do that, then when I come back and make this reflected light here, when I go right all the way to that edge, then those colors are going to mush together, okay? So I'm going to have to come back and reinforce that cast shadow. So that was a don't do the cast shadow while you're still touching up that edge, okay? It does bring up a good point, though. I do want to make sure you guys understand this. Right here, like I haven't done this yet, this is also, you know, kind of what not to do, okay? Sometimes people are like, okay, like, you know, I'm in a hurry, the project's due. I'm just going to avoid the edge, and I'm going to make my cast shadow here, okay? But what happens is that light part, it's going to end up looking like a halo effect is what I kind of call it. Because right now, this part is as bright as my highlight part. And if this is a believable three-dimensional object, there's no way this can be that bright. So you can't leave a gap of white of the paper or anything like that. When you're working on objects, you have to go right up to the edge of it, okay? So right now this is bleeding because we didn't wait. We did that next to that, so that's gonna blend together. So I'm gonna have to come back, reinforce my cast shadow later when it's dry. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about how to add green. So your project is to set up a still life, 3 objects, as simple of objects as you want. I said one object should be a little bit more complex. I'm not talking about, you know, anything too crazy, okay? But now let's see how we can use green, okay? So I'm going to use the, which one am I using? Yeah, number 9 green, okay? So I'm going to grab some number 9. It's real sticky because I haven't used this green all that much. So I'm going to put this here. Okay. Grab a little bit of water, dilute some of it over here. Grab a little bit more paint, make that kind of darker over here. So I have a little bit of a range, even just on my palette. Okay. So when you're starting, if you're not sure how this is all going to work, you know how I said that you can just use the back of old projects, right? Feel free to, I just painted, you know, as I was doing the demonstration the other day, there was a lot of red on here. I can now kind of do this and go over the red with the green just to see what does it look like, okay? If that's pretty dark, what happens if I go over it with just a little bit of green? Okay, but you can see how this value is definitely darker than just red alone. This is a lot more green, right? So you can see how that works. So your goal is to create lots of different values. So as I'm doing this, I can kind of go a few different directions, but I'm going to start with kind of a lighter green just so you guys can kind of see it in like a little bit of a level. So even that lighter green, if I want to come and add a little bit of green, especially where I have my darkest shadow. Okay, I apologize, I have not kind of figured out how to paint watercolor flat and be able to show you what I'm painting at the same time on camera. So we're just going off of your memory of the still life that we talked about the other day. Okay, so that's just the beginning level of it, but you can see how that kind of works. Okay. Is that too much green? We can kind of feather this out, right? So what would happen if I added, like say if I got uncomfortable and I said, that's too much green, can I add more red to it? Yes, but you probably want to wait for it to dry and then add the red on top. So remember, if we have green and red, those are complements. If I were to come back with red, use the brush, and mix it with the green while they're wet, what's going to happen? I'm going to start getting like really muddy looking colors, okay? So you can, but just know that you're going to actually kind of end up with browns. You know, if you're mixing yellow and purple together, you're going to end up with a really kind of weird color. So just know that's going to happen if you do it, okay? All right, so for me, I'm not going to, you know, if I wanted to come back and make a hint of red at the end, I could. But right now, this is definitely going to help me get a darker value, okay? So you do need areas where red and green are layered, okay? You are not just doing this. This is what not to do, okay? You're not just doing this. Okay, this object's red, this object's green. Let's just paint this one, you know, all green and keep them separate. Because then we're just kind of doing a coloring book, right? So if I were to continue that and just make it green, that's really not the goal. So you really do want to kind of work all three objects. First, I just ran out of time. So I'm going to do all of a layer of red, like my lighter value first. So I would do all three objects with some red, like I did with these two. And then I'm going to come back with green, and I'm going to layer it over in certain areas. Can there be some parts that are just pure green? Sure. So if I wanted to add a little bit of green, you know, over here on the vase, where it's a little bit lighter, I'll make sure it's a real light color green. I can definitely do that. Okay, I can put just green right here. And then it'll kind of flow into the red. So if I want to have some part that's just green, I can absolutely do that. But what you want to remember is that cool colors are going to go backwards visually. So the green right here, it's also a darker value, but it's also helping it make like it's curving down and away from me by putting it right there. Okay, if I put a little bit of a cool color up in here, where this real dark shadow is, because it's the inside of the vase, then I'm going to get even a more dramatic shadow in there. Okay? So as I'm switch to a different brush. So as I do that, okay, that green, we add that in, and and then it can kind of feather out. Okay? So the reality is that as I'm painting, I'm probably going to have more areas that are just red than I am just green, okay? Because of my workflow, because I did red first. Some of these lighter areas, you know, I like how they look just red, okay? But I do need to come back and then add another layer of value with the green, whether it's in here, even if it's real subtle, okay? It doesn't have to be a lot. Okay, see how that accentuated that and just like deepened that shadow, just a hint of green. So it doesn't have to be this obvious. It can be kind of subtle like that, and that's totally fine. One thing though that I would do, because I tend to like to finish my projects off with a little bit of a background. We haven't really talked about backgrounds yet. So this area right here, I'm going to kind of show you the little bit of the workflow of how I would do on this project. First off, your 3 objects, you're going to put a background. It's kind of just basically like a horizon line. You can put it wherever you want to that makes sense to you. So you cannot do a horizon line or a back, or like if say the back of your desk. You can't make it down here because then this object would be floating. I would suggest not putting it way up there because then it's going to look awkward that the desk is way over there, okay? So somewhere around here is going to be kind of the most aesthetically pleasing for me. So what I'm going to do is just kind of put in this, try and keep it somewhat even or level. So now I'm going to finish this off with a background. When you do your backgrounds, if you choose to do them, you don't have to, but if you want to add one, first, be real careful on your edges, okay? Do it towards the end part of your project, and you got to make sure all those edges are 100% dry. They cannot be wet or it's going to leak into it. But remember, part of the beauty of complements is that if I want my object to kind of show off the redness of it, let's say, green is going to kind of offset it in a little bit of a nice way. So what I tend to do, and one of the easier ways to start a background, is to kind of start with a concentration of like a background, like a darker value, and it's going to fade out. So I'm going to start with one edge here, and we're going to do a wet on wet technique. So I'm kind of tracing right up to my edge, and then I'm going to get this part a little wet too. It's not drippy wet, just kind of damp, okay? I'm going to take a relatively light green and drop that in. Okay, this is pretty subtle right now. Before it dries, you definitely need to kind of drag out the edge like that and soften the edge. Okay. A rag or a piece of paper can kind of help you if you want to like soften the edge on that. Okay. But this is real subtle. You can barely see it. If I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna start with like the darker value here. I'm gonna come right up to the edge, and then kind of pull it off from there. It's wet on wet, so it is going to spread, but I am going to kind of help it move away from the object. Okay, so I could do this. Okay, I'll probably drop a little bit more down here. But this is a background, like, you know, shadow. So shadows and light are going to move and travel and diffuse. So it's okay. It doesn't need to be even. It can be kind of shifting from darker to lighter, which is kind of the nice way to start this. So that's why I said it's kind of an easier way. You definitely don't want a dark outline. Sometimes that happens as I'm talking and demonstrating. I slow down as I'm talking, and I kind of end up with that. So see how this is kind of like dark, and then it kind of goes dark to light. I definitely don't want it to look like it's an outline of this object. So Gotta come in here and I can either drop down a little bit more of the paint or just help it move around a little bit. And like I said, it's okay if it's a little diffused because the properties of light are like that. It's going to be lighter and darker as the, light and shadow travel. Okay, could I come back here and add more? Definitely. So as I'm looking at it, if I say, okay, I need a little bit more here. But I got to kind of keep track. What is my paper? Is this paint going to travel, along the wet on wet, or is it going to stay put? So you can kind of see as I'm working this, it's starting to not spread as much. Okay, so you got to be aware. Kind of come right along. You can always add more. Okay, if I wanted to make this whole thing a little bit darker, I could definitely come in here and make all of this a little bit darker. Okay, so as you're doing backgrounds, you do have to kind of work quickly, okay, before it all kind of dries up. But you can see that green really kind of makes the red pop. It ties that in to where the green on the objects actually makes sense. So we get kind of a whole concept of unity in our object, and our whole painting is kind of coming together and making sense now. Okay, so your project, you're gonna set up a little still life. You gotta find a space in your house that you can leave objects, and you need a light source because you have to have cast shadows. You need to be able to see highlight and shadow. So make sure you watch the video on how to set up a still life. If you can't keep your objects in that space for a long period, because you're going to be working on this for a few days, if you have to move the objects because you're on the dining room table and you got to eat, then take a picture. Another thing you can do is put tape down around where the object is. Okay, just a little bit of tape, not the whole thing. Just put that on a little thing where the objects go. Make a little bit of a marker for you. Then you can move the objects, and then when you come back to it, put the objects in the same place. Use the photo for reference. But obviously, I cannot make you do this. But if you want to really work on your painting and getting better, you want to work from three-dimensional objects, not a photo, okay? What happens is that this is two-dimensional, this is flat, okay? So I need to try and make something that's three-dimensional, two-dimensional. So when I look at real objects, I have to translate three-dimensional into two-dimensional. And that's a process for me that I have to learn and figure out how to do. If I take a picture of it, the picture is already two-dimensional. I'm already seeing space as a two-dimensional thing. If these are on a photo, I can see this is up higher and this is lower and all that. If I'm looking at the objects live in person, I have to figure out the spatial relationships between these, the depth. I have to figure out where the shadows are on the cast shadow. Okay? So obviously, I can't make you work from three-dimensional, but just realize that when we get back here on campus and we do still lifes and things like that, you're going to be working from three-dimensional objects. Okay? So do your best to try and honor that because it will actually help you very much in the long run in terms of developing your eye in terms of space and shadow and form. Okay? So it is real important to do it, but I obviously am not at your house, so I really can't enforce it. But try and do your best to honor that. Okay. All right. You're going to do a still life, 2 colors. Okay. Not monochromatic. We have 2, but they have to be complements. So here's your color choices. Yellow and purple, orange and blue, green and red. Okay? All right. Have fun, and we'll see you in the next video.